With no further ado, I am going to once again thank what looks to be almost 300 participants so far for joining us and showing interest in this extraordinary, useful, innovative tool developed by UNDP and UN Women to track the quality of policy responses on COVID-19 from a gender perspective. The tracker was co-created by these two agencies, and it analyzes government policies that have been introduced to mitigate and respond to the impact of the crisis and to lay the path for ambitious, positive structural change towards gender equality in the future. So this high-level discussion is going to explore how women's empowerment can be included and prioritized in these responses. I'm not going to tell you one of the big headline findings of the tracker regarding the effectiveness of the entire world in actually making sure that gender equality is mainstreamed. So I'm going to quickly go over the agenda, and then we're going to launch into the first remarks. So we're going to have welcoming remarks from the UNDP Administrator, Achim Steiner, and from the Undersecretary General and Executive Director of UN Women, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. I'm not going to read all the names now and the titles because time is short. So the next thing to come is a technical presentation of the Global Gender Response Tracker. After that, we have a panelist with 3 distinguished guests who I will introduce in a moment when we get to it. Then there will be responses to questions. And then our final comments will be remarks from Mirjana Spoljaric, the Assistant Administrator of UNDP and the Regional Director for Europe and Central Asia. I am now, without any further ado, going to hand over to the UNDP Administrator, Achim Steiner, to give his opening remarks.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you very much for bringing us together, a virtual event on a very unusual offer to the world. And it's my great pleasure and privilege to join my friend and colleague Phumzile, who heads UN Women, in presenting to you, the world, something that we have worked very hard over the last few months in pulling together. It has involved many in the United Nations family, but also well beyond that. And I think what we have to present today, that COVID-19 Global Gender Response Tracker, is something that, whether you are looking at the issue of gender in a global COVID response context, at a national or at a very local context, even in a household context, hopefully will prove something very important. The Beijing Agenda, which celebrates its 25th anniversary this year, and the 2030 Agenda, are universal blueprints for humanity, guided by the vision of a sustainable and fair world. It bears reminding ourselves of that time and again. While we have seen tremendous progress over the last few decades, change has been too slow, and too slow for many women and girls in particular. Even before the COVID-19 crisis, for example, 740 million women were working in the informal economy worldwide with no social safety nets. During the first month of the pandemic, they saw a 60% reduction in their income. As the world went into lockdown, women and girls faced a 30% spike in gender-based violence in some countries. And new data from UNDP and UN Women sets out that 47 million women and girls could fall into poverty by 2021 as a result of what is unfolding right now. COVID-19 sends a clear warning. Without unprecedented action, the hard-fought gains towards gender equality made over the past 25 years could easily unravel. We have a once-in-a-generation chance, and I would even say responsibility, to set things straight. This new Global Gender Response Tracker by UNDP and UN Women, being launched here today, is one, but hopefully a critical step in the right direction. The data it captures reveals important insights into what governments are doing right now to address gender inequalities as part of their COVID-19 response. Coordinated by UNDP and with the substantive technical leadership of UN Women, the tracker has already examined over 2,500 measures being taken by 206 countries and territories. Truly a global glimpse of what is happening. We found clear evidence of positive action. Pakistan, for example, used digital technology to scale up emergency cash programs, providing benefits to 4.5 million female beneficiaries. Peru adjusted labor legislation to protect the rights of domestic workers, most of whom are women. And Togo is supporting women entrepreneurs and cooperatives with grants and subsidized credits. Overall, however, only 40% of the measures tracked were sensitive to gender. In particular, economic, social protection, labor market responses are so far largely blind to women's needs, with only 18% of those that we surveyed focused on strengthening women's economic security or address unpaid care work. Colleagues and friends, the COVID-19 crisis is an opportunity to build a renewed social contract, to adopt a socioeconomic model and approach that prioritizes social justice and gender equality. UN Women and UNDP are committed to helping countries across the globe to put women and girls, their inclusion, representation, rights, and protection at the center of all efforts to build forward better. And to achieve gender equality, we must accelerate data equality. This tracker is one important contribution in that direction. Thank you again, Phumzile, UN Women, our many colleagues, including from the World Bank, the International Labour Organizations, the Regional Economic Commissions, and many volunteers, including also our colleagues at country level, who have been gathering this data in the midst of this crisis. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to the discussion, our joint actions moving forward ahead. Back to you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you so much, Administrator Steiner. Great to have you with us. And I hope you can stay, but if you need to leave, we understand. And now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcoka, UN Women's Executive Director and my former boss. Over to you, Phumzile.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie, and good evening, everybody. Greetings, Akim. Thank you so much for your opening remarks, my partner in crime. And thank you for all the collaboration of our teams to bring to life this tracker. It's also very important that we're doing this in real time when we need it most, and we can still shape and influence what governments may want to do from now onwards. We are launching this tool in the context in which it is absolutely clear that COVID-19 pandemic is hitting women and girls harder, that the social and economic fallout of the crisis is worsening gender inequality. And of course, the aim of the tracker is to assist governments to address this worrying trend, which is worsening. It is also threatening to hit women in areas that we as United Nations are very highly vested in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it really is quite urgent for us as UN system to address these issues. We are seeing spiraling rates of violence against women, as Akim already said, as women have been under lockdown. We have been able to see through the tracker that services such as shelter helplines are struggling to respond and cope with the increased demand. Women are losing their jobs faster than men in the sectors in which women are highly represented. And of course, women have precarious contracts with no security. The contracts are not enforceable, and they do not have savings and insurance. And also, we know that not just during COVID-19, but even before 19, there's been the crisis of care, where women are shouldering the greater burden for unpaid care. But also the closure of schools has worsened the crisis for women, as some women have to homeschool and take care of children. And the crisis is creating huge difficulties for government's ability to respond and protect people in these different categories. Our message to governments is that they must consider the impacts of the crisis on women and girls and take positive steps and use what we are providing as reliable data. And we may not be the only ones who are providing this, but we are also offering what we can contribute to facilitate. We are excited about this tracker because it provides unique data on what governments are already doing. It gives us incredible information in the 3 policy areas, in the measures that have been taken to address violence against women, in ensuring women's economic security, and the support of unpaid care work. We noted that only 25 countries, which makes up 12% of those analyzed, have holistic response with the measures that span all 3 areas. Most of the measures captured in the tracker in the 705 countries out of 135 focus on tackling violence against women. It was heartening to see that many countries indeed responded positively to the Secretary General's call on addressing the issue of violence against women. But on the unpaid care, the response of government is less encouraging. Less than 1/3 of countries are taking action in this area, and their response also tends to be minimal. I just want to highlight that as women are losing jobs, many of them are likely to fall back into unpaid care work. So this is a sector that is bound to increase, for which policy is needed. It is also an area where individual workers are not in a position to organize and join unions. They actually need policy intervention that supports their well-being. And all unpaid care work provided by women benefits healthy men who are earning a salary. So it is one of the most challenging situation that only the united actions of governments can address and address adequately. And of course, we have much more work to do on addressing the economic context, the tracker tells us. And with the work that has been done, especially much more work also done by UNDP and us, UN Women, which we can still consolidate even further, we can use this tracker to analyze what is happening in the area of economic support, especially with the fiscal stimulus that the governments have announced, some of which, and in many cases, in fact, are not reaching women in the informal sector. So we thank you, colleagues, for the support that you've given us in this work, and we look forward to hear more about this wonderful tracker. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And now, I'm sure everybody wants to know, what is this tracker, all 468 of you? So I am handing over now to Sarah Hendricks, the Director of the Policy Program and Intergovernmental Support Division of UN Women, and also Raquel Lagunas, the Acting Director of the UNDP Gender Team. I'm gonna leave it to you guys to tag team this, because I'm sure, so I'm not gonna call you out sequentially. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. And indeed, together with Raquel, we're delighted to be here and provide more detail and context to this incredible data tool. Indeed, the UNDP Administrator and UN Women's Executive Director have really said it loud and clear in their opening remarks. The pandemic is hitting women hard. So how are governments around the world rising to this challenge? And what policy measures are they taking to confront issues such as the surge of violence against women, or to strengthen women's economic security, and also to address unpaid care work, which, as we know, is rising. To answer these questions, UNDP and UN Women joined forces to build and to now launch the global COVID-19 Gender Response Tracker. And in it, we have compiled and analyzed over 2,500 policy measures across 206 countries and territories. We've made every effort to ensure that the tracker is as comprehensive as possible, but we're also following a moving target at a global scale. And so the tracker is therefore a living platform, and we are striving and will continue to strive to improve it with the help of our partners, with member states, with civil society, and of course with other UN agencies across the UN system. And today we're here to share some of the emerging trends that have been identified so far. So with that, let's jump to the next slide to look at the global picture. And here, our global review really points to some striking analysis and striking findings. Specifically, what we see is that more than our global review specifically identified 992 gender-sensitive measures taken by 164 countries in response to COVID-19. More than 70% of these measures focus on stepping up action to address violence against women. And certainly this is a heartening response to the UN Secretary General's call to action for member states to counter the increasing reports on violence against women and girls in the midst of COVID-19. Tomorrow, in fact, UN Women will be hosting another high-level side event, which will profile the actions across stakeholders to address gender-based violence in the context of COVID-19, really showing the utilization in action of this gender policy tracker as the basis for analysis. What you can see from this slide is that much fewer efforts were identified to target women's economic security or to address unpaid care, with only 177 and 111 measures respectively. This is a super important gap. It's one that my colleague Raquel from UNDP will say more about in just a minute. But let's jump now to a slide on the response related to violence against women. Let's take a closer look at the measures that governments have taken to respond to the surge in reports on violence against women. Here, what we see is almost 2/3 of these measures across 121 countries have focused on strengthening services for women survivors, followed by awareness-raising campaigns, notably 18% of measures across 88 countries. Some very interesting exemplars, when you dive into the data, start to emerge. For example, in Jordan, we see an emergency response team with female police officers at its core was formed and trained to respond to the crisis, including by conducting home visits to refer violent survivors safely to essential services. In India, the National Commission for Women launched a WhatsApp number, really bringing technology and the response together to report cases of domestic violence. And in Hawassa City, Ethiopia, safe city messages on prevention and response to domestic violence and to sexual violence were shared with religious authorities to better enable community outreach. Services to respond to and prevent violence against women must be treated as essential and therefore be an integral part of COVID-19 response plans overall. But when we look at the tracker, knowing what we know about the importance of violence against women being seen as essential, what we see is only 48 countries have actually taken this step in policy responses. And this is worrying. The pandemic will have long-lasting consequences on women and girls, on their exposure to violence, and only commitments that are part of government's sustained and long-term planning and policies can effectively address these. Really considering this challenge, we do see some exemplars of positive practice. For example, in Colombia, the Ministry of Health has adopted a new resolution to transfer financial resources to implement response and protection measures for violent survivors. In Sweden, Sweden has channeled additional funding of approximately 9 million euros to civil society to support their work in COVID-19 to address rising reports of violence against women, children, and also LGBTQI+ persons. Violence against women and girls, as we all know, is an egregious violation of human rights. But we also know from the data, it generates high economic costs for society at large. A global review of various studies looking at the economic costs of intimate partner violence found that these range somewhere between 1 and 2% of GDP. And as governments seek to address economic recovery and transformation, it's critical to bear in mind that these costs far outweigh the investments necessary to prevent violence from occurring in the first place. We believe that the data from this tracker can help us both individually and collectively advance the policies that are needed in response. With this, I hand over to Raquel to provide us with further details on the measures that address women's economic security and unpaid care work. Over to you, Raquel.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So let's turn now to the question of what governments are doing to ensure women's economic security and also raising unpaid care burdens. So as you see in the slide, economic security is measured through 3 sub-dimensions: social protection, labor market, and fiscal and economic measures. So if we go to social protection in particular and labor market initiatives, compared to the violence response, you are going to be impressed, but not surprised maybe, how global social protection and labor market responses have been largely gender blind, and the numbers talk. So as the pie chart shows, out of 1,310 measures adopted to respond to COVID, only 10% target women's economic security. The main social programs in this context are cash transfers and food assistance that prioritize women as main recipients. And we have, as Sarah was mentioning, and there is reason for hope, we have good examples in Rwanda and Togo. Rwanda, for instance, targeted female-headed households using decentralized governance structures to distribute food and other essential items. And Togo is supporting women's entrepreneurs, informal workers, and women's cooperatives with cash and grants and subsidized credits. So we have good examples that we are going to, you will find in the tracker. If we turn to fiscal measures, we see how fiscal measures channeled resources to female-dominated sectors in economy. However, we can find some positive practices across the region. So even though if there are few good examples, we have, again, as I said, reasons to think that other countries can follow the same example. We have Jamaica, for instance, that has prioritized fiscal support to tourism because tourism has the higher share of women. So they are providing public sector loans and subsidies. And we have Colombia that has developed training programs for women in the digital economy so that they can continue selling their products during the online during the lockdown. Let's go now to the next slide where I will show some numbers on unpaid care work. Thank you so much. So here we have only 61 countries. Globally, this represents 1/3 of all the countries that we were able to track. Only 61 countries directly addressing unpaid care in COVID, representing only 8% of the total social protection and labor market responses. So you can see in the chart that the main 3 policy categories addressing unpaid care are social insurance, social assistance, and care services. This includes, for instance, expanded family leave provisions for employees with care responsibilities, and cash for care programs that compensate parents from for school and child care closures. So again, we have good examples in 2 countries that I'm going to mention, Austria and Poland. In Austria, workers with children can take up to 3 weeks of care leave for full pay, and this is partly subsidized by the government. In Poland, parents are entitled to 14 more days, additional days of childcare allowances. So in the context, for instance, and I go to the next subcategory, in the context of unpaid care and labor measures, governments are introducing, for instance, shorter or flexible work arrangements and additional wage subsidies. And we have good examples in Bolivia and in Montenegro. We tend to think that everything happens in what we call the North or high-income countries, and we have outstanding examples for many other countries. Bolivia, for instance, allowed parents to reduce working hours for COVID-related family care, and Montenegro provided wage subsidies for caregivers. Just to finish on this slide, I wanted to mention also that an important measure during the pandemic has been state support to continue functioning of care services, including here childcare services, long-term care for older persons or persons with disability. We have a very good examples in Australia and Costa Rica. So in both countries, both countries ensured childcare services remain open during the lockdown. So there is again a lot to learn, and you can find in the global tracker in the platform every measure and good practice. Let's go to the next slide. I will finish here because we cannot close the presentation without talking about the future, talking about recommendations or the next steps to ensure a more gender equitable and responsive recovery. So first of all, it is so important investing in gender responsive social protection. And here we wanted to mention prioritization of social protection floors, universal social services, and national care systems. Our second recommendation is, of course, the prevention of, and addressing violence against women needs to be treated as an essential and integral part of the response and recovery plans and policies, going even beyond emergencies. So the third recommendation is fiscal and economic policies need absolutely to channel investments in economic sectors and activities that advance women's economic recovery and empowerment. Not only recovery, we also want empowerment, including through entrepreneurships and decent employment. And here is very important to promote women in non-traditional jobs, including in the digital economy. The next recommendation is about women's leadership. Women should be also leading the response and recovery efforts. So this needs to be, and it will be part of the next phase of the global tracker, and as we intend to also measure women's leadership in decision-making in COVID. And finally, we definitely wanted to push for something bigger, for the forward better, and it means that we need to discuss and get a renewed social contract and new resilient economic models that are able to redistribute power and resources and focusing on equal rights and social justice. So how we can achieve this is for the stellar panel that we have. So before handing it over Anne-Marie, I wanted to encourage countries to explore the tracker, please. If we are missing any measure, if there is a measure that is new, let us know, contact us, send us your comments. So thank you so much. Now over to you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you very much, Raquel and Sarah. I am sure all of you are excited to explore this tool, which you can do. It will be live immediately after this meeting. You get it off the web on data.undp./gender tracker, all one word. Check out what your country is doing, look at regional themes, and all the data that's there. I cannot stress enough how extraordinary it is to have a real-time tool like this that will hopefully help us to seize the moment for being innovative when governments are willing to experiment with social protection and other measures. This time around, let's make it transformative for gender equality. So to speak to this topic and to speak about actual real life experiences, we are so lucky today to have an extraordinary panel of people who can really tell us about this. So for our panel today, our first speaker is going to be Minister Elizabeth Gomez Alcorta from Argentina. She is the Minister of Women, Genders, and Diversity. We also have the economist, Professor Mariana Mazzucato. She's a professor at University College London, and she's the author of The Entrepreneurial State and the Value of Everything. And then we also have Hakima Abbas, who's the executive director of the Association of Women's Rights in Development, also known as AWID. So I'm going to turn first, please, to Madam Minister from Argentina, Minister Elizabeth Gomez Alcorta. It happens that Argentina is one of a number of countries that are recognized in the tracker for its phenomenal performance in experimental and innovative social policy to mitigate the impact of lockdown, but also to address the specific ways in which gender relations are affected and women's rights are affected. So before I pose the question to you, I'm going to apologize in advance if I have to interrupt in any way because we're already running 10 minutes behind. Each panelist has 10 minutes to get to 2 questions. So I'm going to ask everyone to try to be succinct and concise in their responses. So Minister Alcorta, let's start with the issue of gender-based violence. Argentina, like many other countries, has seen a surge of gender-based violence, domestic violence, and it could get worse with the economic crisis to come. So we can see from the tracker that your government has made a very strong response. Can you tell us more about what Argentina has been doing to prevent and address gender-based violence?
Sí, buenas. Can you hear me? Firstly, I would like to thank you for inviting me to participate in this event, to launch and publicly present a tool of vital importance for mapping out the policies that drive our countries in the area of gender. Definitely, the work of systematizing and making this information available allows us to jointly project shared criteria for the development of strategies aimed at gender equality and the protection of women's rights and diversity. In this sense, from Argentina, we celebrate the work of the United Nations agencies in this area. As you all know, in December 2019, a new government took office in Argentina, which has placed these issues at the top of the public agenda with the creation of the Ministry of Women, Gender and Diversity. Specifically, this ministry has a mandate to formulate, coordinate and implement policies to guarantee the right of women and LGBTI+ people to a life free from gender-based violence. On the specific issue at stake here, it's important to share with you that on July 3rd, 2020, the National Executive presented the National Action Plan Against Gender-Based Violence for the next 2 years, 2020 to 2022. This plan is a result of a broad participatory process, which made it possible to incorporate the proposals and preparations of people from all regions of the country, from the public sector and from civil society. In fact, many institutional meetings, forums, and coordination bodies, state bodies, and agencies were promoted to present participation, both in person and virtually. This is a comprehensive plan that aims to address a widespread and structural problem in a participatory, federal, multi-agency, transversal, and intersectional manner. It is based on the premise that gender-based violence constitutes serious human rights violations, and that it is the state which must adopt the necessary measures to guarantee the promotion and protection of these rights, and to ensure that women and LGBT people can develop autonomous and violence-free life projects. The plan also includes more than 100 measures for which 42 bodies, including ministries and decentralized agencies of the national state, are directly responsible for the prevention, assistance, protection, and reparation of gender-based violence, focusing on policies for the most extreme violence, such as femicide, transvestites, and transfemicide. This plan is not an isolated measure, but is part of a broader and more ambitious policy which aims to make violence more complex and contextualized in order to design strategic and efficient interventions. At this point, and in advance of the next question, I would like to emphasize that we at the Ministry are aware that violence is preceded and to a large extent motivated by situations of structural inequality between genders. In this way, we do not conceive of policies on violence as being dissociated from policies on equality and non-discrimination, but rather we propose a comprehensive approach. We are convinced that it is necessary to recognize the capacities and strengthen the resources of people in situations of violence so that they can build their lives free of violence. In order to do this, we presented a program which launched last Friday, we launched it with the President of Argentina, and which helps people and provides direct assistance to people in situations of gender-based violence who are at risk through monetary transfers and comprehensive accompaniment for 6 months. We do this directly with women who have suffered gender-based violence, and we also assist them, we could call this a social and psychological assistance, and is part of a policy that has its horizon, along with others, to modify the structural conditions that reproduce gender-based violence. And to conclude, an answer to this question, I'd like to say that in December 2019, when we started the administration, we faced the challenge of creating a new ministry in a context of economic crisis and with a dismantled and indebted state in Argentina. Within a few months, we were struck by a global pandemic that impacted everyone's lives. The measures that we adopted from the national state, which are identified in this instrument presented today, show that the response to a crisis of this magnitude requires solidarity, collective and feminist efforts. That's all. And now I'll wait.
Madam Minister, thank you so much. You did anticipate my next question, in fact, which was in relation to the provisions and the policies that Argentina has introduced on unpaid care and the policies on women's economic security. So I'd like to, since you actually have been very economical with time, I'd like to give you the opportunity to spend just a couple more minutes talking about your efforts on deepening an overall social protection system that is gender sensitive, that doesn't penalize women for doing unpaid care, for being mothers, etc. So a social protection system that is gender responsive, but is not only designed to respond to an emergency, but that can actually promote long-term systemic change. So for you, what would you say are the key measures that are needed to build this kind of a system that can promote systemic change?
Bueno, poner el cuidado en el centro de la agenda económica y social es clave, así como entender al cuidado como un derecho,
Putting
¿no? Derecho.
care in the center of our agenda is very important. the right to be cared for and
como
the
decía
right to
antes,
care
para
for others.
revertir
The
la desigualdad
mandate
entre
is
los
very
géneros y las
clear
inequidades.
to revert gender inequality. So we need to strengthen the government's position in this area. We need to have a powerful state with the will to promote the interest of women who are caring for others. So we need to also eliminate the obstacles to exercise their rights. From our Ministry of Women, Gender and Diversity, we have taken this agenda very seriously. We have a technical area that is highly specialized, trying to design policies for care. And one of the first activities is a federal mapping that we are working on with the support of CEPAL. And the objective here is to highlight the distribution of the care tasks in society, in the households, so we can promote public policies in this sense. We also have an interministerial care table that unites two areas of our ministries. And we have a resolution now that has been approved to create it. So it becomes institutional, and so we can promote better care, more fair care, and a better distribution within the household of this task of caring for others, and to recognize care as a need and as a job, as well as a right. So we are coordinating this table, and it's a very important task for us so that we can move this forward. So it's not something symbolic anymore.
Como tarea inicial, esta mesa
So as an initial task, this ministerial table is very important to analyze the existing policies so that we can propose new initiatives to move this forward to guarantee a rights-based approach for those who provide care and for those who receive care. And to answer your question, I can tell you that the objective that we have in this institutional space are to recognize care as a job, a right, and a need. To redistribute care among women and men, other entities, and among state, private sector, household, and the community, remunerate in an adequate manner the different persons who carry out this task, to represent the different sectors in a better way so that they can have a voice, to reduce the workload within the families, to ensure care as a right for all families, recognizing their diversities, because families are very diverse nowadays. To guarantee care for the elderly, persons with disabilities, persons who need any sort of support, and to guarantee policies for the elderly within the paradigm of human rights, to guarantee the right of girls, boys, and adolescents to receive adequate care without violence in an institutional level and also within their communities and families. So in general, I think that's my answer. And what we need to do is to revert gender inequality. And in order to do that, we have to advocate for the social organization of care. Thank you very much.
So, Madam Minister, that is extraordinary. Oh, you can't hear? How about now? Yes? I would like to say that's extraordinary. Frankly, we all know, those of us involved in policy making, there's nothing like a crisis to concentrate everybody's mind. But the opportunities for feminists to use a crisis to introduce systemic change are rare, because feminists are rare in government and in decision making. And you're an example of why women's leadership matters so much in moving out of this crisis. Now, I would like to move on to somebody who is a specialist in looking at how policies change and capitalism is affected by crises, and that is the economist, Professor Mariana Mazzucato. who is at University College London. And as I mentioned before, she's the author of The Entrepreneurial State and the Value of Everything. So Professor, you've mentioned, and others today have also mentioned, that COVID-19 represents a major opportunity to build back much better. But you've warned that we can't make the same mistakes that we made after the 2008 financial crisis. And I could mention a number of other crises where we haven't been able to seize the moment. So please tell us more what you mean here. And based on what you've seen in government's response to the crisis and even what you've seen in the tracker, what do you see as the major opportunities and pitfalls?
Sure. Well, thank you so much. It is a true honor to be in this dialogue with you all. And I find the Global Policy Tracker and Gender Equality actually a really useful tool for doing what I'm about to argue should be done. So let me first start with that. It's interesting that you said capitalism is affected by crises. I would argue that the particular form of capitalism that many countries have, obviously there's differences, actually causes the crisis in the first place. It's not just affected by it, and that's key. Because if we keep just looking at the symptoms, then we'll just constantly be bandaging things up. In fact, as you mentioned, we have, in very recent years, lived through a massive financial crisis, and we failed. We failed to actually go after the causes of the crisis. We just looked at the symptoms. We bailed out the banks. We bailed out particular sectors that were affected by it. We didn't look at the cause, to the point that actually, one of the key causes of the financial crisis back in 2008 was the level of private debt, and how many citizens, in order just to retain their existing living standards, had to actually take out debt. So the level of private debt to disposable income globally is back at a record level, and that's what caused that crisis. So it's quite striking that so much attention after the crisis was placed on public debt and not private debt. And that's just an example of how we end up, looking at the wrong thing. And so, as you mentioned, just think back to January and February. We were not clapping healthcare workers. We were clapping, or at least, worrying about and looking at the workers who were helping, floods in Venice, which is the part of Italy I'm from, or forest fires and fires in cities, places like California, Australia, and elsewhere. Just lots of different symptoms of what the climate crisis, which has been affected by the form, again, of capitalism that we've chosen, has caused. And so the big question is, what can we learn from these crises instead of just patching them up, and even worse, creating recovery mechanisms which actually lay the pathway for the next crisis? And I think a really interesting thing with this particular pandemic that we're living through, which is absolutely tragic and continues to be for all the reasons that were just mentioned, the burden is definitely being felt more by women, and especially working class women, and women of particular also racial and ethnic backgrounds. What can we learn from that? And I think what's interesting, and I'll just speak about some concrete examples, is that we're seeing in some countries the willingness to create a particular structure around the trillions globally that are being thrown at sort of the fire, in this case, the pandemic, right? So whether it's helping particular sectors in the tourism industry, in the airlines industry, in industries like automobiles, to structure the recovery schemes to industry itself in such a way that really does, as opposed to just talking about it, build back better. And so I was quite, it was curious that in France, for example, Macron, the president, said, we're not here to bail out companies, we're here to transform them in such a way that actually reduces, for example, their carbon emissions. So the money that was given to Renault and to Air France was conditional on carbon reduction. And I think what your policy tracker does in a really interesting way, and it should be done quite quickly, governments have to interact with this, is what are the conditionalities that could actually emerge from that tracker so that the recovery schemes actually build back a more inclusive, but especially gender equal, or not especially, also gender equal, inclusive society. And again, other examples of how this has been done in different areas is that in Denmark, those companies that are using tax havens are not eligible for the recovery schemes, right? So there's ways that in other domains this has been done. And I do feel that what you're doing here with the tracker is providing a concrete, targeted potential metrics that we can use for conditionalities of this sort. But also, care, and the care that women provide globally in the home, especially, but not only when we are locked down, and so there's more people in the home, it's quite known that this kind of care is not well accounted for. And so, you know, we can talk about this as much as we want, but we still have indicators of national well-being, so GDP, that only look, for example, at those services that have a price. You know, I often give this example as a joke, but if you marry your babysitter, GDP goes down. So I often tell countries, if you're just worried about GDP, be careful, don't marry the babysitter. And that's because an activity that was being paid for then might still be done, but it simply is not being paid for, so it doesn't enter GDP. That's a really stupid way to account for wealth. What we should really be asking ourselves, what are all those different activities, whether they're paid for or not? And of course, we should be paying for them, but there's also other issues around that, that we need to be valuing. And the fact that we're not valuing them is one of the key problems. And the fact that all of a sudden globally, this term key workers and essential workers has come into the common vocabulary, I think is a really concrete opportunity to question that. And of course, this is already something that feminist economists have been writing about for a very long time, but we cannot let the world get by with using such a fantastic word like essential work and key work, which we know has been undervalued, you know, for example, healthcare workers being underpaid, absolutely, but also many other key workers, without actually making that a thorn in the side of the system. And so making sure that the narrative that is out there right now around key workers and essential workers is transformed to be a new way that we value this collective creation of wealth in our society, where we haven't actually not only valued it, but accounted for it in our metrics. I think this is a moment to do that.
Absolutely. And that was very helpful in terms of thinking about the structure of this crisis. Your work and your book, The Entrepreneurial State, is of course about uncovering the artificial separation between public and private, and the way that capitalism distorts or creates a kind of a very narrow view of the relationship between the state, business, families, and individuals. So in your mind, and like through the lens of the COVID crisis, where does gender equality fit into this picture? How can a focus on gender equality, perhaps helped by this tracker a little bit, how can a focus on gender equality explode these artificial distinctions and promote a more egalitarian society? And you've got 2 minutes for that one.
Okay, well, one of the things I've been pitching for, and luckily, at least in Europe, it's turned out to have had some effect. There was actually a vote in the Parliament and the European Council around this topic that I've been writing about, and as a special advisor in the European Commission was able to write about and then ask for it to be considered seriously, was that we need better policy. We need policy that's problems focused, you know, so the fact that we have 17 sustainable development goals, 169 targets beneath them, and that we have an SDG around gender equality, that's SDG 5, but also ones that are about different types of inequalities more broadly, that's SDG 10. We need to be serious about this, right? This cannot just be talk about the sustainable development goals. We need to find a way to very concretely get policy, industrial policy, innovation policy, procurement policy, to be levers and funnels through which these SDGs actually get done, right? And one of the ways to do that is actually to create moonshots and missions beneath them that galvanize as much activity and investment across lots of different actors and sectors in the economy. And the missions themselves, this is very key to your question, who defines them, right? So, the moon mission, getting to the moon and back again 50 years ago, which was very, again, galvanized lots of activity and investment, innovation. The whole software industry actually was a spillover from that. Who's deciding the missions today? The SDGs require missions that really are co-created. This cannot be a top-down process where academics like myself come on a platform like this with business leaders and policy leaders. We really need proper citizen engagement and women's voices, but structured women's voices through those different organizations that have been campaigning for gender equality, I think are absolutely necessary to be at the table ex ante, not ex post, right? So whether that's even about the climate strategies, a carbon neutral city has gender implications. There's almost no mission that I can think of that doesn't have gender implications, and really getting with women's voices there to design, to imagine what kind of society we even want to live in, as well as the implications for the wrong design of that on women is key. And where I would sort of finish that point on, and then I'll shut up, is that we need to think about gender issues, not just in terms of the redistribution aspect of it, but the pre-distribution, how we create value. I already mentioned the accounting aspect of that, but literally how we engage, how we collaborate, how we reimagine, the society, whether it's the future of mobility, whether it's the climate, the green transition, whether it's the future of work and the kind of work that we actually want. We need much more forcefully to have women at the table, but also your tracker then allows us to make sure that we are literally on track. And that's what all the SDGs need. Again, I could go on, but I'm very wary that I'm using too much of my time.
Well, that is fantastic, and actually provides a wonderful lead-in for our next speaker, because you've talked about daring moonshots and accountability, but all of this requires women's leadership, and the engine of women's leadership, its driver, its origin, and the place where these notions of pre-distribution and defining the agenda come from is the women's movement. And we have here Hakima Abbas, who is a worldwide recognized leader of the Association for Women's Rights in Development. So Hakima, AWID has launched a campaign called the Feminist Bailout Campaign. So can you tell us a bit more about this work and what the key demands of feminist organizations are at this time, and can the tracker help?
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, and thank you to all the speakers. I feel you've set me up so well to talk about the bailout. It's very much what the professor was talking about. When the pandemic began and when we saw the looming economic crisis, I think as people's movements, we were quick to action because of what we'd learned, and in some ways are still paying for during the 2007-2008 financial crisis. So a feminist bailout is about calling for a just economic recovery and about centering women and the most oppressed in those demands. And of course, that's hugely important when we know that economic inequalities mean that women do the most precarious work, carry the largest share of unpaid care work, are paid less than men, all of the things that we've heard from everyone. But also that impoverishment isn't a natural phenomenon, but a deep-rooted set of economic policy choices. And so when the pandemic, which I think laid bare the devastation of those economic choices, it really laid bare the real costs of privatizing health systems, of the lack of social protection, the devastation of decades of neoliberalism. We also saw, and many of us were directly affected in different ways, many of our movements, and according to the ILO, 81% of the world's workers are negatively impacted at this moment. And so the call for a feminist bailout really resonated with feminist movements and women in our communities. And there was action from Algeria to Kenya to Haiti, Thailand. Women took action wherever they could, and feminists. They took to the streets, to the internet, to the airways to call for real change. And as the tracker showed, there are huge differences in policy responses and practice across our different contexts. And so feminist demands during that week of action weren't uniform, but there were clear threads. And so what we at AWID are doing at the moment is putting those threads together in what we're calling a global feminist bailout program. And that's really the intention, as the professor was saying, of kind of what are the bottom up, I don't like that language, but what are the citizen up ways in which we can put demands on the table globally? And our attention was to hone in on the policies, the changes that are possible now, but that do lead us to a more just economy. So, and it's perhaps important to be clear here that a feminist recovery plan is just that. It's an economic recovery plan. It's not the feminist economy we want. But what we want to do is lay out some clear policy demands that enable us to get on that path towards a feminist economy that we also need. And so we thought, if you think acupuncture, points or actions that can really change the energy flow or open up new pathways to a just economy that centers people and planet. So I'll just, in the interest of time, give maybe 2 examples of some of those pathways, and particularly one that I think, because it's come up so much and it's really interesting and important to hear, is around the public infrastructure and systems of care. And it's great to hear the minister from Argentina talk about what they were able to do there. But I did notice in the tracker that that attention to care is very uneven globally. So we saw it in North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, and to some extent in Latin America and the Caribbean, but less so in other regions. And yet I think governments are missing a real potential for concerted attention and investment in care infrastructure. I mean, if you imagine what an economy could look like if we reoriented around care needs rather than around production and other things, it would be a completely different logic to the economy. And care is central to thriving societies, the planet. So even though for centuries it's been undervalued and underpaid. So the pandemic has really exposed a present weakness in the social protection systems, but also revealed how strongly our societies depend on care work. And so the need for robust investment to address gender disparities in care. And at the same time, the pandemic, we know, has also sharply increased the care burden of women at this time. So states in the recovery must invest in care infrastructures and services. The other second point that I'll highlight and stop there is around global tax and debt systems. Redirecting tax incentives and stimulus packages away from corporate bailouts, which is again the lesson from 2007, which the professor did allude to, and military expenditure towards things like universal income, cash transfers, public infrastructure. And I think the same is true for public debt. Particularly, I'm thinking of my continent in Africa, where really public debt has enabled us, if I have conversations with finance ministers where they'll tell me, what can I do? The money simply isn't there. And so, but we know that wealth, vast wealth exists in this world. The wealth of billionaires and transnational corporations has grown exponentially and in figures that are unprecedented in the history of modern markets during this pandemic. So the wealth exists in the world and we need to redirect that. So just to conclude, Anne-Marie, a feminist bailout is only one step towards what we need, which is a feminist economy. And I believe that's possible, not least because what we were told 6 months ago was impossible has been done. For example, private hospitals have been made or put to public use, albeit in the short term. So we really need bold propositions and ideas at this time. And we simply can't afford to go back to business as usual and to what was considered and shouldn't have been considered normal.
Absolutely, absolutely. And incidentally, the point about public financing for many of these measures has been brought up by many of the people who are posing questions. Just a reminder, folks, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and indicate which speaker you'd like it to be directed to. We won't be able to get to all, but we're going to give it a shot. And then for Hakima, I have one last question. Women's civil society voice is so crucial to getting to the kinds of policy and systemic changes that you and everyone else has talked about. Yet, of course, in a context of lockdown, let alone the many implications of the crisis for women, the extended care burden, the greater domestic violence, and all the rest of it, that has a dampening effect on women's activism. And on top of that, there are opportunistic, let's call them patriarchal populists, who are seizing the moment to silence human rights critics, women feminist critics, and so on. On top of that, as another form of silencing, there is at least one government that has instructed women's health organizations not to speak, have no voice on the subject of reproductive health and rights in a particular area, of course. what does this mean? Right when we need women's activism the most, what can we do to keep it going, especially since so many of women's tactics have involved physical presence, protests, and so on? Tough question, and you have literally 1 minute.
Oh no, as you said, there's been ways that the pandemic has deepened authoritarianism, accelerated occupation, and been used to pass laws to roll back reproductive rights and deepen surveillance. And I think there are two things around closing civic space. One is limited space to influence, so the seat at the table. We're relying on a lot of platforms like these that we're speaking on now, and we know there's a digital divide to affordable, reliable access to these platforms. So we need to bear that in mind and find ways where we can engage citizenry differently. And of course, there's the danger of over-reliance on these corporate platforms and what that might mean. But then just to end, there's also the piece around the limited political space to organize, to protest, to dissent. And I think we need to empower and enable spaces for contestation. Any thriving democracy requires that space. And frankly, people will take that space whether or not it's allowed. But in a thriving democracy, we need to really make sure that those spaces are opened up, even if there are restrictions for health. Just last thing, I think the pandemic really shows how important it is to have pre-existing solidarity and strong community networks. We saw that in responses like in Kerala, in the state in India, where they were able to use existing women's assemblies and networks to provide health education, food distribution, and other support. So it's really important that civil society is able to do all the work that it does. Thanks, Anne-Marie. I hope I didn't take too much time.
No, that was perfect, and I was a bit too hardline actually, and that was really useful. I hope there's some donors listening who heard Hakima's last point loud and clear. That continuous investment in gender-based or women's solidarity networks, community provision systems, feminist organizations. Invest now, because you never know when a crisis is coming, and it's absolutely true that the best responses seem to come from areas where there's these pre-existing networks. Okay, so that was fabulous. Thank you to the panel. And we have a huge number of questions. And I have the challenging task of trying to read a few out. I am going to target them to our individual speakers. So for our minister, Alcorta from Argentina, let me make sure I've got this right. We had a question from Diane Elson and another one from Elizabeth Graff, and so I'm going to combine them for you. And the question is, these questions have to do with how are you enlarging the fiscal space? How are you able to create more flexibility around finding funding for these innovative programs that you spoke about? One person asked, are you able to use gender responsive budgeting to track allocations for gender equality spending? Or is there any kind of international action that will help you enlarge your fiscal space? And that actually, I think, relates to the point that Hakima also raised about tax and debt systems. So would you like to take about a minute to respond to that? Thanks.
Sí, claro, gracias por las
Thank you very much for those questions. I would like to share with you a figure, a data that I hadn't shared previously with you, is when I mentioned that in December 2019, we created the Ministry of Women's Gender and Diversity. Argentina moved forward quantitatively and qualitatively regarding the previous situation in the country. So before that, we had a Women's National Institute that depended on Social Development Ministry. The budget, so the national system sent a budget for the 2021, and we've seen a major change in the budget compared to the previous institute, and the increase has been 23 times. So the budget has been increased by 23 times compared to the previous budget, and this is because we have different policies related to equality, and also because some of the financing, we are receiving some of the financing as a loan from international donors, but that's only a loan, so we need to pay it back. Undoubtedly, it's a political decision, and this is very important. We can't analyze this in any other way. We are investing, and I like to use this word, the word investing. We're investing, it's not an expense. We are investing in these policies because we must know that we can't reduce gender-based violence unless we make a big investment. And there's also been a lot of work done because it doesn't all depend on just allocating a budget. The key of this is having a horizontal policy which includes all the stakeholders. So about a month ago, the president established a decree, issued a decree for the horizontalization of gender-based policies, and on the 1st of October, we will have our first meeting of the team that, and all the ministers have to be at that meeting as well. And the idea of this is to make all of this a reality and to try and create a gender-based budget that will allow us to identify all the policies, programs, and actions that the state is carrying out, and always with a gender perspective. For example, in Argentina, Argentina has 56 programs that are considered to be gender-based programs compared to last year, 2019. What do we mean by policies, gender-based policies? So those that deal with issues such as gender-based violence, social security, housing policies with taking gender into account, etc. And this all depends on our ministry, the Ministry of Women and Gender. However, the ability of identifying the policies and the decisions of our government to center on gender-based policies, I think it's very linked to the resources and the investments made. So this is not a symbolic issue, but it is very difficult to make any structural changes that we all know are very unequal, structurally unequal, if we are not making a real investment from the state. It's true that we are at a time of crisis due to the pandemic, but also in Argentina, as you probably know, we are experiencing a very difficult crisis. But during a crisis, we need to find ways of finding the money for that investment. That's a political decision, but it is possible. So I think it's important to realize that we can only leave this crisis behind by investing, by including everyone, and, as I say, creating a ministry just for women is a very important investment. And it's a very large investment, as you probably know, for the state, because the bureaucracy to create a new ministry is a very large investment. But without that, it would be very difficult to introduce real and effective measures, because Argentina is a very large country with a large population and with large diversity. So it is, and especially regional diversities within the country. So we don't all have the same situations. We don't have the same inequalities, and the caregiving is not the same in the whole country. So the key is political decisions, and that the president of the state makes those decisions and implements them. In our case, our president is already doing so. And no wonder, and undoubtedly in our case, the gender agenda is a top priority.
I'm just waiting for the translator to finish. Thank you, and your efforts are extremely impressive. with such conviction to get that budgetary space. Your remarks reminded me actually of another issue which we haven't discussed today, is whether the tracker could start looking at inequalities between women, such as, of course, racial and class inequalities, which will greatly affect which women are affected the most by the crisis. But I'm actually going to move on and pose to Professor Mazzucato pretty much the same question, which is for the low-income countries that are really struggling with the macroeconomic fallout of the crisis, how can, it's again a question of expanding fiscal space, and what kind of international, you mentioned international cooperation, global cooperation, what kind of international cooperation is going to be effective, and do you see that materializing around issues not just of providing budgetary space for the kinds of social protection measures that are needed, but also around making sure that treatment and prevention have a international cooperation around those areas have a gender focus?
Great question, and I think the concept of low-income countries has to be I don't want to say abandoned, but it's a bit it's too broad, and it allows us to fudge over the real issues. So the degree of state capacity that exists in low-income countries is extremely different between them, depending on the investments they've actually made along the way, precisely the kind of investments that the different speakers have actually been talking about. So for example, both in Vietnam and in Kerala, in India, they've actually had a much more successful response to COVID-19 than in some advanced developed countries that haven't been investing within their public sector capacity. And I'm thinking of capacity to do exactly what was talked about, which is to bring civil society to the table, to actually engage in what I would call symbiotic, not parasitic, public-private partnerships, and really to mobilize different parts of society, from academia, the army, which yes, unfortunately is often very important, the private sector, and again, different types of civil institutions. And that depends on the actual strategy in the particular areas that we're talking about. So for example, using, really bringing and redesigning procurement strategy alongside health and R&D to crowd innovative solutions towards particular groups that are being the most affected by COVID-19, that requires, to actually have that as a remit of policy. And if that doesn't exist, then policy ends up just kind of dispersing funds at best to categories like SMEs, whatever that might mean, the size of a company, as though that itself is kind of an organizing device for a strategy. And so, having said that, I think that the issue of gender, and I think you rightly also mentioned class, and we've talked about race, and also in some countries, ethnicity is hugely important in terms of the different inequalities that exist. Always remembering how inequality is both a cause of the extent to which this crisis has been a crisis and an effect, I think is very important. And in that sense, I think, I see this with the labor movement, right? I mean, labor currently I think has to almost reinvent its role. Trade unions, without them, we wouldn't have weekends, we wouldn't have 8-hour work days. These were social innovations, which were incredibly important, had a huge impact to everybody, also people who weren't unionized. And I often ask trade unions, what is the equivalent of the weekend today that that you're fighting for? And making sure that labor's voice, but within that, women's labor voices and gender voices are at the table, in terms of, what I was talking about before, actually thinking ex ante, not just ex post, is important, because the trade unions have actually been caught off guard in this case. So if you think of the climate crisis, there's this wonderful term, the just transition, right? We want to transition towards a better economy, a greener economy, and many workers along the way might be left behind. So we need to be investing in people's ability to transit, right? To actually get new skills so that they don't just get unemployed. But that concept assumes that someone has defined the transition, and then labor's voice is there to make sure it's just, right? And I think it's very important that we are not so reactive, having these different voices and having gender at the table, and gender organizations, women's organizations of different class backgrounds at the table, to even define what kind of transition do we want? What kind of recovery do we want? And why is it important both in terms of the effects. So there's different groups. I know in the UK, there's a fantastic group called the Women's Budget Group that every time a budget comes out, they immediately look at the effects on women. But more importantly, again, ex ante, they think what would be the ideal budget that actually tackles head on, not just the inequalities, but, you know, the really ambitious agenda that we might have as a society to value women's work and actually to create, you know, a new opportunities and new, anyway, you know, a better economy. And so I think that's currently what's missing. And I do think, I would like to just throw out there a challenge to trade unions to be much more progressive or they are progressive, but to be on the offensive, not just on the defensive, offensive in the proper state of the word, to actually be reimagining the future and not just to be defending workers against a lot of the bad things that happen when that future is designed in narrow and siloed ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. So on this point about organizational strength and daring, I turn, of course, to Hakima Abbas with a question from the audience, which is, I'll read it out. Given the challenges that we see to the participation of women and feminist organizations, especially in this moment, what can the United Nations do to ensure that these spaces are opened up and accessible, including the kind of spaces that Professor Mazzucato just spoke about? And I'm going to just toss one other little gem in there, item anyway, is in the sort of situation of the crisis of multilateralism that we're seeing right now, what can the UN do to amplify women's voices in these processes?
I think that's such an important question at this time, as you were saying, Anne-Marie, in terms of the crisis of multilateralism. And when the professor was talking about a just transition, I was thinking about how, in some ways, yes, that requires really deep local engagement and really deep internationalism and global solidarity. Because what might be a transition in a country, let's say in the north, might still be extractive or deeply difficult for those of us in the South. And so we need that global solidarity, that global dialogue to bring all of these conversations together. And the participation of women and feminists broadly, including LGBT people, needs to be across the board. And one of the things I think the tracker does, which is really important, and this speaks to the contribution of the UN, is make public what we might not know otherwise. Some of the policies in some of our contexts aren't being published publicly and need to be. And as I think we have said, that the participation of women feminists needs to happen not after these policies are taken, but these policies need to be decided on with the participation of women and feminists. One last thing I'll say on participation and a strong kind of women and feminist movement globally is around what we're hearing on the reduction of aid. And I think that's going to have a huge impact if states, and particularly donor countries, don't pay attention to what that means in terms of funding for women's rights and feminist agendas. And I really do think that we need to be careful that that's not exactly the place that gets reduced.
Absolutely. All right, so we're really tight on time. So please, could each of you take literally 30 seconds to say, of everything you've spoken out, about what is the one thing that would really make a difference now on decisions about how to handle this crisis? And I'm going to go backwards. So 30 seconds to you, Hakima.
So I would go back to global solidarity and feminist participation.
Fantastic. 30 seconds to you, Professor Mazzucato.
Takes me 30 seconds to unmute. So a public sector investment with social infrastructure at the core and gender equality as a concrete metric to make sure it matters, so we don't screw up again like we did with the financial crisis.
Awesome. This is being recorded, so you guys can go through this and write that down afterwards. Not you guys, the audience. And Minister Alcorta, 30 seconds. What's the one thing?
un Estado potente, un movimiento de mujeres y de la diversidad en la calle movilizado y feminismo popular internacional.
Fantastic, fantastic. You guys have been so inspiring and knowledgeable. I'd like to turn now to Mirjana Spoljarek, the Assistant Secretary General, who is the Assistant Administrator of UNDP and the Director for the Regional Bureau of Europe and CIS, and UNDP's Gender Equality Champion. So over to you for the final remarks.
Thank you, and thank you, colleagues and participants. I want to thank you all for this rich and very meaningful discussion that we had the pleasure to listen to. And Anne-Marie, I also want to thank you for the excellent moderation, and you really right on time, which was a challenge. And it is also a challenge for me now to, summarize intelligently what we have heard and what was really a very rich exchange. Having listened to the presentation, the natural conclusion should be that there is still a lot of work ahead of us, and that we have to jointly strive and continue to work towards achieving gender parity. But I want to most of all conclude today on a positive message, because the dialogue was so encouraging and gave us so many good examples of where we need to invest going forward. Let me just name a few. First, many of the measures that today are temporary due to COVID that we are looking at, like the cash for care or the introduction of basic temporary income, can evolve into long-term policies. And we spoke a lot about better policies, as Professor Mazzucato called them. So they have the potential to change development trajectories in the future, and we should take advantage of this opportunity. Second, the fact that most countries are addressing the escalation of violence against women and girls in domestic space is a sign of positive change in societies. Although what has been done to date is not yet enough to stop the shadow pandemic at a necessary scale. Third, and very importantly, we are slowly and very surely building a common understanding about how unpaid care work is essential to our survival and prosperity as humans. Women perform each year 4.4 trillion hours of work, which represent a volume of work equivalent to that of 2.2 billion full-time jobs. In other words, unpaid care is a fundamental part of the infrastructure which sustains our economies. And COVID-19 responses started to recognize this disbalanced division of labor between men and women. And as the executive director of UN Women rightly said, there are no unions for unpaid care work. We need right policy interventions. And the Minister Gomez Alcorta rightly said, and this is, I think, extremely important, is that we have to recognize that unpaid care is a job, a right, and a need at the same time. And if we do that, we can really take a step forward in this debate. And finally, our expectation is that the COVID-19 Global Gender Response Tracker can become a space featuring real-time data and analysis, a space for policy-oriented evidence debates, and guidance for governments. But it can also be a tool for transparency, for fostering global and regional and national dialogues between civil society, women's movements, politicians, and national decision makers. And as Hakina Abbas said, one of the key roles that the UN can play is to make things public and bring to the attention of the policymakers. Mm-hmm. And remaining at the policy level, we are all aware that governments and policymakers face difficult choices as they maneuver through this pandemic. There are competing demands and limited resources, and we spoke about this. However, some countries are already demonstrating that where there is a will, there is also a way. And we heard a lot about the Argentina experience. So gender equality must be prioritized to not only effectively respond to COVID-19, but also to create the transformative change required for more resilient and sustainable societies. We have a concrete opportunity here to build back better, as Professor Mazzucato said, and we certainly should not miss it. And we have to move towards a feminist economy. I very much like that term. Or a just economic recovery, as Hakeem Abbas said. Now, before closing, I want to thank all those who made this event possible. And I want to, most of all, thank the teams who created this impressive platform. First, to our partners from UN Women, who contributed with expertise, rigor, and commitment beyond duty. Laura Turkett, Silke Stab, Constanze de Busch, and Juncal Plazaola. I also thank and commend UNDP colleagues for their ambition, passion, and great experience. Aroa Santiago, Esuna Dugarova, Tamilola Adeoye, and Daniela de los Santos, as well as to all data coders and colleagues from both agencies who supported the data collection and validation, making this tracker possible. UNDP is committed to remaining a trusted partner in supporting governments to effectively integrate gender equality into all of their COVID-19 responses and recovery efforts. And I first and most of all want to thank UN Women for the always close and productive cooperation with UNDP, and to all for your participation today. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ana Maria.
Thank you. That was a terrific summary, and we're out of time. And so please just bear with me for one little housekeeping point. One more time, if you want to see the tracker, it's data.undp./gender tracker, all one word. Please go to the website and have a look. This has been an extraordinary discussion, and it kind of kills me that I haven't had a chance to go through the Q&A carefully, because such intelligent, interesting, challenging questions have been posed. So there is a recording. I understand from UN Women staff and UNDP staff that there will be a record kept of the questions. I hope that the panelists get to see them. There's going to be an FAQ page on the Gender Tracker site, so you can pose additional questions and get answers to these questions. And so I will thank you all, wonderful speakers, exceptional panelists, for your time today. And to you, the global audience, thank you for an incredibly engaged exchange on the Q&A. And congratulations to UNDP and UN Women for developing this tool so fast, and a tool that is so relevant and so helpful. So with that, I think we're all going to say goodbye, and huge thanks to all of you.